Welcome, everybody, to episode 50 of Generation Jihad. I would say the long-anticipated episode 50. Bill, what do you think?
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, Tom.
I am Tom Joscelyn, and I'm here with my colleague, Bill Roggio. We are senior fellows at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we've been running FTD's Long War Journal for many years now. We're going to do a little something different in episode 50 here. For any of my fellow nerds out there, we're going to talk about epistemology with respect to the counterterrorism field. Now, obviously, this is not exactly a hot seller, I would say. I don't think that's how you. I think you're going to get a big audience. As soon as you drop the word epistemology, there's probably a lot of people who are like, "What the heck are you talking about? We're out."
Did half of you tune out already? Or?
Yeah, but look, it's one of the long-standing issues that you and I have discussed, Bill, behind basically off camera or outside the podcast. It's one of the things we discuss on the phone quite a bit and via email and discuss with a lot of different contexts. There are basic epistemological problems when it comes to the study of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Taliban, and like-minded or affiliated groups. Basic problems. And these basic problems have existed all these years. And so what do I mean by epistemology or epistemological problems? Well, obviously, epistemology is the study of knowledge or what you know and how you know it. In the case with respect to these terrorist groups, these terrorist organizations, I think both of us have found, Bill, and correct me if I'm wrong, that basically people make a lot of assumptions that aren't necessarily supported by anything, and then they build their entire analysis on the assumption. And we could point to a lot of different examples of that, and it's a very common thing when reading. There are a lot of times I'll be reading a paper on, for example, what Al-Qaeda is today. And it's just larded with a bunch of assumptions that aren't sourced to anything. They don't come from anywhere. It's just basic perceptions that the author has. And look, this isn't to criticize everybody or to sort of, poke my thumb in the eye of the rest of the field. But I am critical of the fact that there basically have been no standards devised throughout all these years for understanding any of this, that there's no criteria for understanding what's going on. There's no basic benchmarks have been set. And we're going to talk about what I mean in terms of benchmarks in a second. But Bill, I mean, that's basically right. You share the same concerns, I will say, of all this.
More than concerns. It's a frustration as well. The key issue in all of this should have been defining our enemies, and we not you and I, but the wider field and the U.S. government and allies have failed to do this, and it's led to issues just as you discussed with, just ad hoc definitions of what Al-Qaeda is and what it wants, and putting Western ideas stamps on what Al-Qaeda is instead of looking what Al-Qaeda tells you that it is, Islamic State or any of these other jihadist groups. It's very, 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 very difficult to watch this day in and day out in our field.
Now, look, I mean, I'll say about this too, before we get into the nerdy details here, I really hope none of this matters for American national security in the future going forward, right? Like, I hope that this doesn't have there's no negative consequences for all this that we're about to get into. I suspect there will be, right? I suspect that there will be.
I concur, Tom. I mean, that's, I feel like we're at the September 10th, 2001 point where we just stuck our head in the sand, think that we could attack these groups and defeat them using air power. We've taken our eye off the ball on these jihadist groups, and they're still in the fight, and they're still planning and plotting. They still view us as an enemy.
And what I'll say about that too is I always have bifurcated in my head anyway, an assessment of these organizations from the issue of what you should do about them. I think when I talk about the epistemological problems, I'm talking about the former, not the latter. When it comes to policy, there needs to be a rigorous debate. I'm going to be first to tell you I don't have all the answers or even claim to. And I don't know at this point what America should do in a lot of settings. I mean, if you've heard previous episodes of this podcast, I'm deeply ambivalent at this point about a lot of this. However, that shouldn't change how we view or assess, these organizations. I think a lot of times people read into these organizations their policy desires as opposed to the other way around in terms of figuring out what these groups are doing and then debating or trying to decide what to do about it, if anything. right? In some cases, not doing anything. You can choose not to do anything in some cases, which is an issue in and of itself. When you talk about foreign policy, a lot of times people want to believe that you have to do something. In some cases, I'd say no, you don't. You don't have to do anything. And sometimes doing something is worse than doing nothing. But none of that should change our understanding of these organizations and how they operate. So let's go over a couple of things here to illustrate our points, Bill. One, we're going to talk about this new reward offer that's been put out by the State Department's Rewards for Justice program for Abu Obaida Yusuf al-Nabi. He's a longtime AQIM leader who was named the overall emir of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb last year. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a new report put out by this team of experts that works for the United Nations Security Council. There are a lot of nuggets in that report that we need to get into. And we're going to talk about some of the political rhetoric or some of the other things that have come up in the news recently, including President Biden saying that we're going to use over-the-horizon operations just in case Al-Qaeda returns to Afghanistan. And spoiler alert, Al-Qaeda is already there. We're not waiting for them to return. So we'll get into that a little bit too. But that reflects an epistemological problem in and of itself. It shows that there's a misunderstanding of what the actual situation is, regardless of whether or not you agree with President Biden's decision to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan, for example. And you can hear my own ambivalence on all that in previous episodes of the podcast. Regardless of whether or not you agree with it or not, that's just not an accurate assessment of what's going on there. So let's start off at the top, Bill. Let's talk about Abu Obaida Yusuf al-Nabi. His nom de guerre indicates he's an Algerian. He served a lot of senior roles for AQIM through the years. But here's what I found interesting is the State Department releases this reward of up to $7 million for information on him. This is this program that they use to try and incentivize people to turn over, to betray these jihadis and give up their location to counterterrorism forces or to others, local forces, or basically, however they want to handle this behind the scenes. And there was a line in this reward offer that stuck out to me. It said that Abu Obaida al-Nabi, quote unquote, is expected to play a role in Al-Qaeda's global management. Okay. Well, this immediately draws to our attention one of the main fundamental epistemological problems when it comes to defining Al-Qaeda. There's this idea that there's this core of Al-Qaeda, and then there are these affiliates. And in a lot of what you see written about these issues, they're almost mutually exclusive or distinct. There's no overlap between the two. And none of this is well defined. That model, that paradigm is not defined based on a rigorous analysis of, for example, primary sources from Al-Qaeda. It's not based on, a deep understanding of the personnel or the biographies of these guys who run Al-Qaeda's global operations. But here's a line that, although it's hedged a little bit, the State Department is saying that Abu Obaida is expected to be part of this global management team as the head of AQIM. So he's not just the emir of AQIM. He's also thought to play a role in the global management of the Al-Qaeda organization. Bill, I'll let you tee off and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. Just first, I would say just by the fact that he leads one of the branches, and this is a big problem you and I have, right? The branch versus the affiliate idea.
In that case, it's just a matter of language, but we can get into that. Yeah. But it means something.
It does mean something, right? Yeah. The affiliate is used to when that language is used to say, well, there's just sort of tenuous links between
loosely affiliated.
Right, exactly. Right. Versus a branch being this is one of the arms of Al-Qaeda, or and that is the more accurate description.
And branch, just for listeners to understand, Al-Qaeda itself uses the term branch in its internal discourse. So it's a much more organic thing. When you read their own papers, they talk about their branches. And it's much more organic because it evokes the image of a tree, right? It's all part of one organism, one living organism. The idea of affiliates, I think unconsciously or not, or consciously, who knows, it depends on how
I think it's intentional, Tom. I do.
With some people it is. Other people, I think it's just a word that gets thrown around and people it just sticks. Yeah. It definitely evokes quite the opposite. It evokes this idea that they are just these, loosely affiliated or sort of tangential to the whole thing organizations. And in the case of AQAM, of course, you and I have been involved in debates in years past where people said, well, they just took the Al-Qaeda name. They're not really part of Al-Qaeda. And here's the State Department saying that the leader of AQAM is expected to also be a leader within Al-Qaeda's global management infrastructure.
Right. And yeah, and I would argue just by definition, by his position as one of the heads of Al-Qaeda's branches, as a head of one of Al-Qaeda's branches, that he is just by default a senior leader within Al-Qaeda's management. And we know, Tom, from past communications between Drukdel and Nasser al-Wahishi, who was Al-Qaeda's general manager.
And then you talk about Abdul Malik Drukdel,
Yes.
other known as Abu Musab Wadud, who was the first emir of AQAM. This guy, Abu Ubaida, actually replaced him in last year after Drukdel was killed in a French-led counterterrorism operation. And I'm going to get into Drukdel in a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, right. But and we know through others, right? We've seen communications with Shabab's emir, with Al Qaeda Central. It's a well documented. They're communicating back and forth, so they're planning. They're pooling resources. Their money flows back and forth. All of these things. Again, I would argue it's not the language in that State Department that he's expected to play a role in Al Qaeda's global management. I would argue he is already playing a role just by definition, just by default of him being a leader of one Al Qaeda's key branches. He's been a very influential figure within Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, has served as Drukdel's deputy for how many years, Tom?
I don't know, a number of years.
Decade?
A while. At least he's been around. He's been around for a while. I mean, I remember when he, after Bin Laden was killed, he was the official for AQAM who renewed the allegiance for the British to Zawahiri.
Exactly.
So
that's a decade ago, right there.
Yeah, it speaks to how important he is within the organization and how respected he is that he would be the one trusted with that to do that at the time. And this isn't to say they don't have problems. They have all sorts of internal problems for sure. But this is a guy who's been around for a long time, but you were talking about, his role in the Al Qaeda global scheme, and he's the successor to Abdul Malik Drukdel, otherwise known as Abu Musab Wadud. Of course, this is a long time Al Qaeda figure. He was the previous, he was the head of the organization. It was previously known by the acronym of his French name, GSPC. And then he oversaw the formal merger of GSPC into Al Qaeda's ranks to make AQAM, Al Qaeda Islamic Maghreb, in 2006 and into 2007. And so Drukdel was killed in early June of last year in a French-led operation. Here's the thing that I reminded readers in a piece of the Long War Journal just this week. The French military officials described him, this is being Drukdel now, the head of AQAM, as Ayman al-Zawahiri's third deputy, explaining that Drukdel was also a member of Al Qaeda's global, quote unquote, management committee. Well, Bill, what does any of that mean, right? Third deputy, he's, the Naib Emir or the deputy Emir. We know that currently that's probably Saif al-Adil. Before it was probably Abu Muhammad al-Masri. These are two Egyptians that are based in Iran. Abu Muhammad was killed in August of last year. Saif al-Adil was alive and still alive as far as we know. Those were expected to be the, first and second deputies to Ayman al-Zawahiri. Does this mean the French think that Drukdel was right behind them in the pecking order and was that high up that he was basically in the line of succession to possibly succeed Zawahiri someday? I mean, that's the implication of it, right, Bill?
It sure is. I mean, I can't come to any other conclusion. And unfortunately, we couldn't get any further information from the U.S. military. It didn't want to comment on Drukdel's position. The French, dropped that line and ran. So, we're stuck with trying to use deductive reasoning to figure out, okay, what does this mean? What does Al Qaeda's global management committee look like? What decisions does it make?
What entity is that actually? What's the name?
Right.
What is the name of it within Al Qaeda? What does it do, and who's on it? Right. These are the epistemological issues here that I would say most of the field just basically ignores. They don't raise the issue, let alone try and express that this is a problem, right? In terms of understanding all this.
Yeah, and just to voice the frustration, it seems at times when we ask these questions of State Department, of Department of Defense or others, it's almost like we're annoying them by continuing to try to understand what Al Qaeda is, what its senior management team looks like, and how they operate, like as if it's not important, but it is very important to understand Al Qaeda's structure. You've said this to me numerous times, and I believe you even said it on the podcast at some point. We haven't the U.S. government for what, probably 15, 20 years hasn't made an effort to try to define Al Qaeda, what it is, what its senior, how is it organized, what are its committees, who's leading these committees. We've just seen zero effort to educate the public and the wider counterterrorism community to provide this information. So it's almost like we're being nuisances, Tom, for trying to figure this stuff out.
Yeah. So the point I make there on that is that the last wire diagram of sorts that I'm familiar with that the U.S. government provided on Al Qaeda is in the 2004 9/11 Commission report. It's a bipartisan report. It reflected the intelligence estimates of Al Qaeda prior to 9/11. And so we're sitting here in 2021. I'm not aware of any other attempt to provide a wire diagram for Al Qaeda or how it works. And that was a very rudimentary diagram, by the way, that was in that report. But that reflects basically what the U.S. government thought Al Qaeda looked like prior to 9/11. Well, that was 20 years ago. Almost 20 years ago now. And the thing is that we see hints that there are parts or boxes from a wire diagram in various statements. We're going to talk about this UN report here in a second, which provides some more hints. But you see them in the, you and I focus a lot of times on the Treasury and State Department counterterrorism designations, the terrorism designations that come out. And part of the reason why is because there are little nuggets in there that tell you that there is some sort of wire diagram to be had, right? And we should start trying to figure out what it is. And so, because they identify via the biographies of designated individuals, designated terrorists, they provide little snippets. Like, for example, in 2016, we learned that the head of Al Qaeda's military committee is in Iran, right? Well, a guy we refer to as Hamza al-Khalidi, has various other nom de guerres. He's somebody who's well known within Al Qaeda. He was basically a field commander for Al Qaeda who was groomed for a leadership position. But the thing is that, he's the type of guy where nobody was talking about him prior to the designation by the U.S. Treasury Department of him as a terrorist. And nobody was talking about, everybody knows Al Qaeda has a military commission, right? That was on the wire diagram for prior to 9/11. And we know that the U.S. hunted down some figures within the military commission over time, including right after 9/11. But nobody seems to be concerned that we don't really know, what does this overall thing look like, right? Like, what does the military commission look like today? What does it do? Who staffs it other than Hamza al-Khalidi? How does it work? How does it make decisions? How does it communicate with people outside of its immediate orbit? All these questions are all epistemological questions that seem to go not just unanswered, but often unasked, I would say.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Tom. It's well said. It's the lack of curiosity out there for all this. And I think this is part of the, you had mentioned the policies and politics, I would add to that, versus the actual understanding of the group. Well, when you're promoting ideas that Al Qaeda is dead, it's irrelevant, it's a shadow of itself, it's all of these things, well, then there's little curiosity out there to try to understand what Al Qaeda is today, because the dominant narrative out there is that Al Qaeda is, again, a shadow of itself. What's the latest one they said?
I got to give the Biden administration a little bit of credit, because they've now adopted the other D word, where they have degraded, but they only
degraded.
It's degraded in Afghanistan as opposed to decimated, which is always confusing because decimated implies decreased by 1/10, but then it's sort of the meaning of the word has evolved, I guess, over time in our lexicon. But at the same time, we're going to get to Biden's speech on May 28th. They still recognize that Al Qaeda's out there. They're just arguing that it's basically a lesser force in Afghanistan than it is elsewhere, which I think is a highly dubious proposition. We're going to get into that epistemological problem as well. But here's the point, right? When you talk about the policy ramifications of all this and how they affect analysis, I'll never forget. I mean, I've said this on the podcast before. I was at an event years ago where I was talking about AQAM. And one of the other experts from a brand name expert from a brand name institution said, well, if AQIM is really part of Al Qaeda, then we're going to be sending, a lot of Marines into West Africa to fight them, And I said, hold on, wait a minute. I mean, I haven't even, to be honest, I hadn't even contemplated sending the Marines into West Africa to go after.
I mean, think about that as the U.S. is disengaging from everywhere. You think that that's even a policy option?
Well, at that point,
I mean, that
was before the total disengagement. Sure. Okay, so this is a different time, right? So this is before the total, run away from all this that the U.S. government mode is in, the mode the U.S. government's in now. But my point was, like, I had no intention of trying to justify, nor to this day do I want to justify, increasing, sending a lot of U.S. military forces into West Africa now to hunt down, for example, Abu Ubaidah, Yusuf al-Nabi. I mean, I'm not talking about some major commitment here on any of this. I'm just talking about whatever policy you think is the right one. You should at least have a good understanding of what it is you're trying to combat, right? To a certain extent. And that includes sometimes doing nothing, sometimes doing something. It's in other words, the policy discourse is, in this case, is a good example of where the disconnect the dots paradigm I've talked about so often was used to justify inaction. And I said, well, wait a minute, I'm not really looking to get involved in any of these conflicts here in Africa, but we should at least understand what's going on. Now, what was funny is that at the time, this was a while ago, as this conversation happened. At the time, as we subsequently learned from the Bin Laden files, for example, Yunus al-Maritani was serving as one of the chief external operations planners for Bin Laden. Who's Yunus al-Maritani? Well, he's a guy who was in the GSPC and helped negotiate the merger of the GSPC into the formal merger into Al-Qaeda to make it Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. As his nom de guerre indicates, he's from Mauritania. He's somebody who was reporting to Bin Laden throughout, much of the last couple of years of Bin Laden's life on external operations. So he goes from negotiating the formal merger of AQIM into the AQ orbit to being one of the chief external operations planners for Bin Laden, working out of Pakistan and Iran, by the way. That's an interesting little nugget. And doing all this on behalf of Al-Qaeda. And yet here I am sitting across from the table with a guy telling me, well, AQIM can't be really Al-Qaeda. And literally at the time he's saying that to me, Yunus al-Maritani is actually is actually a bigwig, who graduated from AQIM up into the senior management of Al-Qaeda. And this is where the disconnect the dots and the epistemological problems really come into play, I would say. And here
Sure. Do you mind if I give Abdul al-Rahman al-Maghrebi, right? He's identified, what was it?
We've talked about him in previous podcasts.
Exactly, right? So he's named as the head of Al-Qaeda's external communications office. By the way, external communications office is in capitals.
Right.
And then I'm reading from the...
Pause on that, Bill, right? So this is what you're reading from is another State Department report for information, which I wrote up at Long War Journal, in which they described him as the head of the external communications office for Al-Qaeda. Well, folks, what is that?
What's that?
Right.
What's that?
Exactly.
He coordinates activities with Al-Qaeda affiliates. Obviously, branches, we would argue. Same thing, right? So are they affiliates or are they branches?
And by the way, Maghrebi, as his name, nom de guerre implies, he's from where?
He's from
the Maghreb, right? From Africa, right? And so, right? So these guys can go from, I think he's a native Moroccan, right? So these guys can
I believe that's right. Yes.
Yeah, so these guys, I'm just doing this off the top of my head, but he's also a son-in-law of Zawahiri.
Right? Yep.
He's also in Iran, by the way, which blows up all
right.
sorts of
and that's the point
problems. Yeah.
That's the point I want to make, right? So this was put out, and again, this isn't just something, the interagency process to get someone designated and put on the rewards for justice list. They're saying he's in Iran, he's running operations, external, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of just saying, wow, what does this mean? Al-Qaeda's working from Iran. It's immediately dismissed, Tom, in policy circles, and because this is just drumming up war against Iran. Do you think I want to support a war against Iran when we've failed in Iraq and failed in Afghanistan, can't even beat the Taliban? What makes me think that going to war with Iran is actually a good idea based on Al-Qaeda operating? We should at least understand what's happening. This is what you and I try to do.
And use other non-military means, for example. There's a whole toolkit of things that can be done to combat this. That doesn't mean doing a huge war in Iran is the only option on the table. I mean, it's just again, you and I belabor this point sometimes. We talk about this a lot. But this is just how stupid everything is in Washington, right? Like, you just can't even have a conversation with that without some ignoramus saying it's some neocon push for war or something.
Right.
It's just dumb, It's
right.
dumb.
I'm going to advocate war when we can't win lesser wars.
Yeah, right.
That's the definition of insanity.
And by the way, the Trump administration did pursue one of these alternative means, right? Because the CIA, the Trump administration worked with Israeli intelligence to assassinate Abu Muhammad al-Masri, another senior al-Qaeda figure who we were told he can't possibly be doing anything inside Iran. And whoopsie, he was actually the deputy emir of al-Qaeda and running operations. And so the Trump administration didn't go to war with Iran over this issue. They just quietly behind the scenes helped the Israelis assassinate one of the key al-Qaeda leaders. Now, it goes to show that there are lesser policy options in total war with Iran when dealing with all this. There are still other options, of course, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack you there with McGrebby, but I just thought
it's not a sidetrack. It's a perfect example. It's totally what I had in mind for this podcast, right? But also Assahab, right? He's also the head of Assahab.
Yes.
Right. Well, everybody knows Assahab, right? But what does it do? How many, right? We know it's essential. We know it's the propaganda arm for Al-Qaeda senior leadership. I don't like Central. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But it's actually the propaganda. It's a propaganda arm for Al-Qaeda, the main propaganda arm for Al-Qaeda. Okay. McGrebby's been running, Abdul Rahman al-Maghrebi's been running this for years now. How many people does he have working for him, right? Where are they? What are they doing, right? How do they coordinate? There's all these Al-Qaeda videos that put out by the branches and by senior leadership that oftentimes has this logo with all the different watermarks for all the Al-Qaeda branches alongside Assahab at the beginning. It's sort of meant to show there's this unity, at least within the media side of the organization, right? Why do we discount all that? Why do people pretend like that doesn't matter? Like, you don't think that McGrebby and his folks, who, according to the State Department, he's communicating with the quote-unquote affiliates, meaning the branches. What is he doing, right? How are they coordinating these videos? Are they coordinating these videos? All these questions, right, are not being really asked, let alone answered.
Yeah. To McGrebby, it says coordinates activities. What kind of activities? Is it just media activities? Is it military operations? Is it, there's a ton there. Like, it's funny. Like, remember the...
it also says he was general manager for Afghanistan and Pakistan.
And Pakistan, right. What does
that mean? Right.
What does his staff look like? How many people are on it? That's the one issue I wanted to get when we recovered the Bin Laden files. I was believed when it described that what Al-Qaeda's general manager position, right? And what is his staff, right? We got information from that. There was zero curiosity in our community about what the general manager position, what is it? He had like two deputies. He had, I don't remember the specifics.
No, he had two deputies, exactly right. And they had people,
and then there was
people attending them. Yeah.
Right. There was other positions within that general management staff. Should we assume that McGrebby has a similar type staff? Is it different? Is this the same for the military committee? Is the same for the finance committee? Are there military and finance committees anymore?
What are they doing? How do they work?
Who lead them?
Yeah.
These are the things you and I would love to know. And we think the information, when you see something like McGrebby's designation, a Nabi, right? The rewards or whatever. These are the questions we have, and we just can't seem to tease this out. It's very frustrating.
Well, but here's the thing, right? It is very frustrating. And not only do people not asking about this stuff, it's widely assumed, I would say, in a lot of what's written, that none of this infrastructure even exists. I had a conversation with somebody,
right.
The other day, and this person was telling me that in his opinion, Al-Qaeda is much more organized than people realize, right? And I said, okay, I'm willing to buy that based on these nuggets, scraps of information I have here and there. There's a lot I don't know, and we have to show me, we have to really demonstrate this stuff. But the point is, I said to this person, I said, you realize like the field's de facto position is, the commentary is that there is no organization, right? How many times have you seen people like they talk about Al-Qaeda? It's like, well, if we just get Ayman al-Zawahiri, the whole thing's going to crumble, boy. Like, really? That's what Al-Qaeda is down to? This multi-generational organization has been reduced to a lone Egyptian in his late 60s, and if we get him, it's all over, or if he dies of COVID, we're all good? Really? That's what this all comes down to?
Ayman al-Zawahiri has avoided probably one of the most intensive manhunts for 20 plus years now, or we're going on 20 years now. How did he do that? What is the support organization behind him that allows him to avoid it? Where is he? Is he in Afghanistan? Is he in Pakistan? If he's in Pakistan, Again,
does he have an Abbottabad style villa? You know,
right? Yeah. What are the relationships with the ISI? I have a million questions that no one in our field seems to care about.
Well, and now that there's all these incentives not to care about it, right? Just wish it away. You know, it's all about China now, so don't worry about it. Well, there's another thing about Zawahiri, and just this leads to another point. This is why this is all extemporaneous conversation. Sometimes I think it's probably better than if we try to script it. But remember, you and I right away noticed in September 2019 when the U.S. and Afghans got Asim Amar, they also got Asim Amar's courier to Ayman al-Zawahiri. Oh, whoopsie. So wait a minute. So you have a guy who was communicating back and forth with Ayman al-Zawahiri with Asim Amar, the head of AQIS, in the Indian subcontinent, or at least the former first head of AQIS. We think at that time he had graduated to another position within Al-Qaeda, which of course we don't know what that was either, do we? right? Because nobody knows, right? So it's all this sort of this endless sort of, I hope folks are understanding. Like, look, these are, Bill and I have been doing this for a long time now. And I hope you can find the dark humor in all this, but this is a real issue, right? I mean, think about the basic questions we've already outlined here, and we're just getting started, right? I mean, we've got more to cover here in this. There are all sorts of basic problems with understanding and stuff that really are not addressed, I would say.
Yeah, I just laugh thinking about it. Like, as I ask questions, just more questions pop in my head. I have to tell myself, stop.
Right. Well, because you start connecting these guys, like who's communicating with whom, I mean, it's all right. So let's move on to this. In previous episodes, we've had Edmund Fitton Brown on. He leads this team of experts for the UN Security Council. We've covered his reports, the Long War Journal, and this same team of experts, I think it was his group, came out with a new report.
It's his group. It's the sanctions and monitoring team.
Came out with a new report on Afghanistan. And let's dig into a little bit about what this report says. Hopefully we can have him on again to talk about this. We have a lot of respect for him and his team. They're dealing, part of when we talk with him, if you listen to our previous episode with him, I teased all these epistemological problems, I think, in our conversation with him. I said, I think they're working on trying to figure out what Al-Qaeda looks like. And I said, well, look, there are basic problems here that we have to be thought about and framed correctly to come up with an answer. But this report, there's a lot in this report to cover. We're going to cover just some of it, but let's hone in on the areas where there are some real interesting questions to be asked, right? And so the first thing that's no surprise, this is not really all that interesting, is this team finds that there's, that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda remain closely aligned and show no indication of breaking ties, right? Okay, we know that. That's true. We agree with that. Nobody has been able to provide any evidence of real tensions between the two. This is one of the reasons why we have all these epistemological problems. There's this fault line in understanding the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda that's been exacerbated by Taliban apologists and revisionist history. And there's just a lot of bad information out there about this. I tell people all the time, start with the 9/11 Commission report to get a basic overview of it. And there's a lot of extra details to be filled in from there. But here we are in 2021, and this UN monitoring team can't find any evidence that they're going to sever ties, as was promised by Zalmay Khalilzad, the special representative, and then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. All right, we've covered that ad nauseum in the past, so let's just move on. That's done so far. We'll report if there's ever any evidence to change our opinions on any of this, but so far there's no evidence. The report also says member states report no material change to this relationship, meaning the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which has grown deeper as a consequence of personal bonds of marriage and shared partnership and struggle, now cemented through second generational ties. Right. And this is another issue that we've talked about in the past, that there's all this intermarriage between quote unquote Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. A lot of times you can't even tell which organization these guys belong to. One of the things you did a long time ago, Bill, this again speaks to the epistemological issues here, and I stole this from you, was the idea of dual-hatted guys, right? And in some cases, they're not even dual-hatted; they're like triple-hatted or quadruple-hatted, right? Because you'll have a guy who's an Al-Qaeda commander who also belongs to free organizations that have acronyms of their names from Pakistan. Like he's a Huji guy, and then he was a Hume guy, and he was this and that, and he's also a TTP guy, a Pakistani Taliban, and he's also working with the Afghan Taliban. And you sort of become like, well, wait a minute, how does this all work? And that speaks to epistemological problems here. There's actually this genetic overlap for some of these guys between these organizations that they embody that creates a problem in terms of defining how these organizations work.
Yeah, and the second generation, right? Like that's they're literal genetic and overlap between a Taliban leader, the intermarriage.
That's what I'm saying. Some of these guys are literally the embodiment of the marriage between parts of these organizations.
To its credit, the U.S. military is the one that's first started using the term dual-hatted commanders in their press releases when they were identifying either a Taliban commander who was also part of Al Qaeda or an Al Qaeda commander. Again, what's the difference at that point? If you're dipping your toe in both pools, you might be part of both organizations. That the U.S. military, to its credit, did that, and yet we reported on it, and yet there was very little. To this day, there is very little understanding of that and what that means, and why would we enter? You want to talk about policy. This is one thing where you and I are always very hesitant to discuss policy, but one policy we vehemently disagreed with was negotiating with the Taliban, and that is because of these enduring ties. And until there was direct evidence that the Taliban was either going to denounce or ideally turn on Al Qaeda, there's no reason to negotiate with them, because they are literally supporting an enemy of the United States. And you and I hope most of our listeners abhor any type of agreement that justifies the Taliban's relationship with Al Qaeda, that whitewashes it, and that whitewashes the Taliban's role for its complicity with 9/11. So and other terrorist plots that have happened since.
All right, yeah. I mean, my take on that was a little bit different, which is I don't mind the U.S. talking to anybody, but the point is that there's such ignorance and confusion about all this.
Yes,
they had no idea what they were doing, really. And let me just
if you don't mind,
let me finish this point. So,
go ahead.
Like one of the points I've made is when they talk about the defining the break between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, this plays into the epistemological problems here, because it's clear to me from talking to people who are involved in this process and testifying alongside some of them before Congress and reading their stuff, they can't define the relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, let alone define what a break would be, right? What it would actually take to have a break between the two. And so then to enshrine the idea that the Taliban is going to deliver on this without any kind of enforcement or verification mechanisms or any kind of accountability in that servile agreement between the two, that all you're doing is enshrining the epistemological problems. Basically, you're basically saying, we're just going to vouch for the Taliban without actually understanding any of this, and that doesn't make it. We're going to get into why that really matters here in a second, but go ahead.
Listen, if it was advantageous to the United States, if it actually would further peace in Afghanistan, if it would lead to a break between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, of course I would support negotiations, as distasteful as they are. But as we know, that isn't the case. It was never the case. It was just a flat out whitewashing. So I couldn't support them in current form. That's what I was trying to get at.
All right. So let's go back to epistemological problems here. So one of the other things in this report from the UN talks about Al Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan. It talks about member state information pointing to a presence in at least 15 provinces, which is broadly consistent with what you and I have reported through the years based on various sources. We could do a whole other thing on that, and we'll talk about that in the final segment. But there's another detail in here which talks about how Al Qaeda's presence across Afghanistan is led by Al Qaeda's Jabhat al-Nasr wing, meaning Jabhat al-Nasr is the front for victory or the victory front for Al Qaeda. Well, that's a name I haven't seen before in the Afghan context. That means that according to this information, if it's correct, that has been passed on from member states, Al Qaeda has something called the Jabhat al-Nasr wing of its operations in Afghanistan. Now, I doubt this is wholly distinct, for example, from Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. Talking to some people, I think there's probably a lot of overlap between the two. And in fact, although it doesn't identify him, it says that this wing of Al Qaeda is under the direction of Sheikh Mahmoud, who probably, although I can't say this with certainty, is probably Sheikh Osama Mahmoud, the current head of AQIS, But at least this is a terminology. I don't know where this came from, or it implies that Al Qaeda is using it itself to describe it. But isn't that telling that they have a wing devoted to victory in Afghanistan? Quite the opposite of a spent organization. They have a whole part of their operation, apparently, that is dedicated to their coming victory.
Yeah, absolutely. when you pointed that out to me, my mind perked up, and of course the million questions started cropping up in my mind. And instead, we're just sort of and this is not a criticism of this report, by the way. It's a fantastic report where we think that this is probably one of the best products that is out there, put out on a regular basis to help up our understanding.
And it doesn't mean we think it's perfect. I mean, there are all sorts of issues, right?
Of course.
Right, yeah.
But and in this case, it just leaves us questions. And so it leaves us craving for more. And I am working on getting Edmund on the show, and we actually may be able to get him next week. We'll see. But yeah, so maybe we could ask him when we get him.
Okay, so I want to skip over some of the stuff we talked about in the past. I don't want to get into every little nugget in here. I want to skip to the big thing that requires a lot of conversation. Okay, because the big thing is this footnote. There's a footnote. Let's see here. It's footnote 11, I think it is. Let me bring it up. I'm bringing it up on the screen. Yes. Okay, so this is a big deal. What they say in this footnote, and it's not surprising to you and me. We've covered him for years, but it's a footnote discussing Sirajul Haqqani, who is the head of the so-called Haqqani network. He's also the deputy emir of the Taliban's Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So this guy's a big wig. You remember there was an op-ed published in his name by the New York Times, which I debunked at the time, based on for a lot of reasons, I would say. But this footnote, let's talk about what this footnote says. So this is the sort of thing that's buried in a footnote on a page, where if you actually understand the implications of this, if this is right, it's actually deserves its own report, right? I mean, it deserves its own above the fold sort of coverage in our community, so to speak. And the footnote reads that Siraj Haqqani, I'll skip over the language about his role within the Taliban. It says he is also assessed to be a member of the wider Al-Qaeda leadership, right? So you're saying that the deputy emir of the Taliban is also a member of the Al-Qaeda leadership. What? Right? So you and I reported years ago that our sources said he was, at the time, Siraj was possibly had a seat on the Al-Qaeda Shura Council, the advisory board, to the emir of Al-Qaeda. And I still think that was right. Now, there's been reorganization since then. I'm going to get to the latter half of that sentence in a second here, Bill. There's been reorganization since then, but this is identifying without providing any specifics, and I want to know what the specifics are, how they actually fits into the organizational scheme, is saying that the deputy emir of the Taliban is also a member of Al-Qaeda leadership. Now, is that surprising to you and me, Bill? No, we've been
absolutely not.
How many years have you been documenting the Haqqani's overlap with Al-Qaeda? How many years now? Yeah. Right?
Since 2007, 2008. I mean, we're talking almost 15 years at this point.
And Siraj's father, Jalaluddin, was one of the big, he obviously he worked with the CIA in the 80s, which probably led to some of the epistemological problems here, because, one of the things you and I have discussed is that if you look through the 9/11 Commission report, which has a lot of merit to it, it's also a highly imperfect document. And here's one of the epistemological problems there. There's not a single mention of Jalaluddin Haqqani or the Haqqanis in the 9/11 Commission report, even though the Haqqanis helped build Al-Qaeda and helped build the camps where the 9/11 hijackers were trained, right? So how is that not even mentioned in the report, And so his son, Jalaluddin's son, Siraj, to this day is a bigwig. He's really the I would say he's the kingpin here in some sense for the region and for what's going on. His father, Jalaluddin, not only did he help build Al-Qaeda, but he helped bin Laden escape, according to bin Laden's bodyguard. He helped bin Laden escape from Tora Bora in late 2001. He kept bin Laden alive to fight another day. And we can go on and on and on about the Haqqanis how they overlap with Al-Qaeda to this day. But here's this report saying that Siraj Haqqani, who's currently the deputy leader of the Taliban, is also a member of the wider Al-Qaeda leadership. Well, if you're talking about, this is what I'm talking about in terms of the people who negotiated this deal with Taliban didn't even really understand the relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Did they address the fact that Siraj Haqqani is deeply in bed with Al-Qaeda when they were negotiating it? Probably not. In fact, Siraj's his brother Anas was actually attending the negotiations at Doha, right? So who was Anas reporting to, by the way? If his brother is sitting as part of the Al-Qaeda leadership, what's going on here?
Yep.
Like who's talking? Who are you actually negotiating with? So all right. So the next part of the sentence muddles things a little bit. It says that Siraj is not part of the Al-Qaeda core leadership, which I think is, again, we've already debunked the distinction between core and affiliates. I don't like that term for a lot of reasons. I don't think it means, but it says in parentheses defining the core leadership as the Hatin Shura. Now, this leads us to the biggest revelation, I think, in a footnote in a report, right? What the heck is the Hatin Shura within Al Qaeda? So you and I have been talking about this for a while. We haven't talked about it on the podcast. I haven't written about it yet. I'm working on a report for a Long War Journal on this. As far as I can tell, the Hatin Shura is the supreme body within Al Qaeda. This is the most important part of Al Qaeda. And I think a few analysts have mentioned it in passing in their analyses to their credit, right? And have brought it up. I think it's gotten a mention here or there, but it's not been in any official U.S. government document or terrorist designation. It's not built in or wire diagrammed in any kind of formal way into people's understanding of Al Qaeda. And yet, as far as I'm aware now, basically having asked around about this and working on this for a while, the Hatin Shura, or the Hatin Committee, is actually the supreme body within Al Qaeda, is the supreme decision-making authority, I would say, within Al Qaeda, based on what I'm hearing. Much of the leadership of the Hatin Shura is actually in Iran, and they're running it from Iran, which is, again, raises the epistemological problem. People don't want to admit that there's any overlap there of interest between Iran and Al Qaeda, and that the two can work together, and then the Iranians can provide them safe haven. I'm guessing that Saif al-Adil is probably the head of this Shura. He's also the deputy Mir Ayman al-Zawahiri. But this raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it, Bill? You and I have been talking about this before the podcast. You and I, for the last 2 days, have been talking about, well, what the heck is this thing? How many people are on it? What does it do? How does it make decisions? How does it communicate with parties outside of Iran or elsewhere? Who else is on it outside of Iran? Who's on it inside Iran, right? There's all sorts of questions here about this, right, Bill?
Yeah, no, you asked pretty much the biggies. And yeah, this was when you pointed this out to me, my eyes perked up. I'm like, whoa, this is the first official mention of the Hatin Shura that I've seen in a government document, United Nations in this case. And yeah, I mean, I want to know who's on it, what they do, how do they communicate? Is Anabi on it, right? Are the branch leaders? If they are, and it's a Shura, then they're talking. How are they talking? How often are they talking? What are they discussing? It's fascinating. Is this part of a reorganization? If I recall, Tom, Al Qaeda they used to call it the Shura Majlis, right? For the central leadership. Does that exist anymore? Has that been subsumed by the Hatin Shura? A million questions, and it just leaves us begging for more when we see this.
Well, and then according to the UN too, it says that Siraj Haqqani is part of the wider Al Qaeda leadership, but he's not on the Hatin Shura. Well, then what is he in the wider Al Qaeda leadership?
What's the wider Al Qaeda leadership?
What committee is he on? What Shura is he on? How does this all work? And these are the foundational. This is how insane this all is. We're having this conversation in 2021, and these foundational questions have not been worked out. They've not been tracked. I mean, it goes back to a fundamental issue too, Bill, and understanding all this is that you and I, years ago, remember we talked about how President Bush sauntered out to the podium and he said that America had killed or captured 2/3 of Al Qaeda's leadership. I think it was 2/3. And then President Obama comes out to the same podium and he says that under his leadership, America's killed or captured 3/4 of Al Qaeda's leadership. And you and I both did a double take. We're like, well, 2/3 of what? 3/4 of what? I mean, was it 3/4 of the remaining third? How many guys did we had to start with here? This was always a problem. Like they couldn't tell us how many Al Qaeda leaders were there at the beginning of all this, beginning of the real campaign in 2001, right after 9/11. How many? What was the pre-existing? Sort of base of, no pun intended, base of Al Qaeda leaders. And, then how are they able to, who do they have who were they grooming to replace them? They fell. How many were they able to replace them? Well, what was the starting pool? All these issues, when you saw all these metrics, when you say 2/3 to 3/4, that means you've got a ratio in mind. You're able to calculate. You have a denominator, which should be 100% of the Al Qaeda leadership. And you're saying, that 66 or 67% of that was killed or captured, and then 75% of that was killed or captured. But you and I knew that these were just phony metrics, right? That they didn't actually know. They didn't actually know how many they killed or captured out of the total.
Yeah, so we never really got President Bush's list. Apparently, he had a list, and he would cross the name off it or cross over the picture if it existed, right? So okay, fine. So then
And by the
at
way,
the end
just to insert one thing real quick there, like, it's not
Yeah.
his fault or President Obama's fault.
No,
They
no,
don't,
absolutely not.
or that they don't know
Absolutely
what the
not.
total pool is, right? It's a collective
Yeah.
failure, really. But
Yeah.
go ahead, sorry.
Exactly. Yes. So at the end of Bush's term, second term, he initiated the drone campaign. Really, it started midway through but it really started to take off in 2008. And then it was handed over to President Obama. And then you start seeing the names. You get the hit list, right? That's what we tracked. And these are some really big names. There's a lot of them. I have a page at the Long War Journal somewhere where I document the senior leaders killed in U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan. And obviously, it wasn't just Pakistan where they were killed. There was attacks we targeted leaders in Iraq and elsewhere in Africa and whatnot, Somalia. But when you start looking at this list, you're going, wow, these are really high-profile individuals, very, very senior. Did Al Qaeda regenerate that from as you said, from the 2/3? Did it, or was that pool bigger than that was thought during the time of the Bush administration? And yet, here's the other thing: Al Qaeda's operations have expanded globally.
Its footprint its base has definitely expanded.
Its footprint has exploded, pun intended. And there's more leaders. There's more people to staff. Now you have a teen shura. Does it have 5 guys on it? Does it have a dozen guys? Is it dozens? Is there scores? We don't know. It's probably in the low numbers to keep it actual. If it's a decision making.
Actually, this is where, based on my conversations and asking around about it, I think it's not just a few people. I think this thing is. I think, and this is. I'm going to put a big asterisk around this. So I'm now expressing my own epistemological uncertainty around this, which is vast. Okay, because I'm still working on this. I think it's in the dozens.
I would agree, and here's why I would say that. You would have, very likely, you're going to have your deputy emir, your general manager, every branch leader, maybe their deputies, maybe some key, committee lead. Again, we don't know what it is because no one's actually defined it. But when you start adding those, you're in at least over a dozen, probably 20, in that number, right? It makes sense.
What I'm saying,
but we don't really know.
It could easily be more than that. It's based on what
it could. It absolutely could.
So we don't know. We're trying to figure that out. But the other thing is that this is some inference on my part. I think that this Hatin Shura was stood up circa 2015. Why? Well, because there's a murky detention for some senior Al Qaeda figures, including Saif Abu Muhammad al-Masri, who was subsequently assassinated, Abu al-Khair al-Masri, who relocated to Syria and was killed. He oversaw one of the big fiascos of Al Qaeda in Syria. But these guys were freed in 2015. They were all legacy, senior, veteran Al Qaeda guys with a pedigree that was impeccable from the jihadi perspective. I think that this was part of their effort to reorganize Al Qaeda and bring power under their sway. Bring the organization under its sway. I think it's probably part of it. I think there are other aspects of this, but as far as we know, based on all public reporting, Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Masri, of course, decided to stay in Iran, and they were leading the Hatin Shura from inside Iran. There are other guys. Maghrebi's probably on it, of course, as you mentioned, and then there are all sorts of other guys who we can name as suspected Hatin Shura members. But the point is that none of this has been fleshed out, to an extent that anybody can have any confidence in understanding all this. What I would encourage the U.S. government to do is to designate the support staff. Designate the members of the Hatin Shura. First of all, explain what the Hatin Shura is. Explain who's on it. Explain how it's evolved over time, assuming it has evolved over time, which I think it has. And explain who the supporting staff is, right? Who those members are. Designate them, and also then get into how this body coordinates activities with other parts of Al Qaeda elsewhere. I think that's in other words. Tell the story or flesh out the story of the Hatin Shura and what it exactly is and how it operates.
Yeah, and Tom, if I may, just with one more theory on why was the Hatin Shura formed. We've got to remember if you're correct, and it was around 2015, and I agree, the release of Abu Muhammad al-Masri, Saif al-Adil, and others certainly would play a role in this. But also, at that time, you have the rise in ISIS, which of course is a sort of the bastard child of Al Qaeda. And, Al Qaeda certainly at that point in time was very sensitive And they're going to try to figure out a way to prevent the dissolution of Al Qaeda or the breakup of Al Qaeda. So I suspect, again, but do I know that? No, I don't know that. It's just, I can only guess. But these are the things, why was it formed? I really want to know that. I'm guessing those answers are out there. Please share them with us. U.S. government, United Nations, whoever you are, let us know. We're dying here.
Well, I absolutely 100% agree that the rise of ISIS played a role in this. We know we've caught wind that Al Qaeda had efforts to reorganize internally because of the rise of ISIS. One of the things we know, but we haven't been able to explain it because we haven't gotten clarity on it. But we know that there were, based on a variety of sources, that there was an effort to reorganize these bodies internally to have more coordination across the Al Qaeda branches to prevent another Al Qaeda branch from breaking off and becoming the next, either joining ISIS or becoming the next ISIS. Remember, ISIS didn't earn the defection of any established Al Qaeda branch, contrary to what some of the so-called experts were predicting, right? That didn't happen. AQAP didn't defect, Shabab didn't defect, AQIM didn't defect. Al Qaeda actually stood up AQIS in 2014, which, so established a new branch. Yeah, JNIM in West Africa was established by AQIM subsequently, right? It's evolved, had other problems in Syria, which again, I'm going to skirt around that right now because that's a whole other, you want to talk about
it's complicated.
You want to talk about epistemological problems. You could have epistemological problems just based on the Syria portfolio alone, right? I mean, there's all sorts of problems there in terms of understanding what's going on. And I don't have all the answers there either. But the point is that we know that Al Qaeda took efforts to make sure that ISIS's efforts to poach were limited, that its efficacy was limited. We know that, and you can follow it. I mean, ISIS did have some success in poaching some commanders, but it was never any of the emirs. It was never the whole branches. We know Baghdadi from some intra-jihadi reporting tried to get AQAP to defect, for example, and they didn't, right? We know they tried to get Shabab to defect, and they didn't. And in fact, the Omniat, the internal and security services of the Shabab, there's good reporting on that they hunted down ISIS defectors, So anyway, after 2013, 2014, any of Al Qaeda's organizational decisions had to take into account ISIS and the rise of ISIS and countering such a thing. They wanted to prevent further defections to ISIS, and they also wanted to prevent a new ISIS from emerging. They wanted to prevent a new, Now they also had an additional problems in Syria, which were, one of these characters, Abu al-Khair al-Masri, I think was directly, probably his poor management was directly responsible for some of the problems that arose in Syria, because he was in Syria and he oversaw al-Nusra's rebranding into Jabhat Fath al-Sham, and then subsequently that organization evolved into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. That's a whole other basket of problems right there, and we have no idea, what Al Qaeda thinks about that internally at the moment in terms of how they're dealing with it, how they're dealing with that problem. That's what I mean by that. But again, so all these are epistemological problems, and we can keep going on and on about this UN report. We just want to raise those select few things, especially about the Siraj Haqqani point about Siraj Haqqani being, according to this report, a member of the wider Al Qaeda leadership. That's a big nugget. But let's close, Bill, on one last epistemological issue here. And it talks about how the policy of all this, how this affects how policy is sort of portrayed to the American people. Now, again, you can argue in favor of withdrawing from Afghanistan. You can argue in favor of withdrawing from everywhere, make those arguments. But at least have the facts right about what you're withdrawing from, right? And on May 28th, President Biden gave a speech before U.S. service members and their family members, and he said, I'm going to read his quote here. He said, "And now, as we draw down," meaning from Afghanistan, "we're also going to focus on the urgent work of rebuilding over-the-horizon capabilities that allow us to take out Al Qaeda if they return to Afghanistan." I just want to focus on that phrase, if they return to Afghanistan. Well, folks, the issue is not if Al Qaeda returns to Afghanistan. Al Qaeda is already there. We've been documenting this for years. It's documented in the UN report. You can go across multiple sources in corroboration, from Al Qaeda's Thabat newsletter to operational data to UN reporting to DIA reporting to U.S. Treasury Department reporting. I mean, you can build this composite matrix of reports from all these open source news accounts. There's all sorts of reporting you can put together. It's clear that Al Qaeda is there. You can debate, and there's an epistemological problem in terms of defining Al Qaeda there and explaining how they're there. They are, right? But they're there. It's not a matter of them returning. The question is preventing them from using this as a bait, in President Biden's mind, in the U.S. government's mind, preventing them from using this as a base for future operations, which I think is somewhat a narrow way of viewing this. But anyway, Bill, doesn't that speak to the problems we're talking about here? That that we have the president of the United States talking about if Al Qaeda returns to Afghanistan when we have all these sources that say they're already there.
Yeah, it seems like there's an R word issue when it comes to Al Qaeda in Afghanistan as well, not just the D word. Return, resurgent, renewed. You'll see these things mentioned, and as you and I have argued, that they've been there all the time. They may be rejuvenated because of a Taliban victory, but that doesn't mean they weren't there fighting alongside the Taliban the entire time. One of the interesting things, the UN report gives an estimate of 500 Al Qaeda fighters. I mean, and it's kind of unclear. Is this AQIS, and Al Qaeda command structure, or is that part of the team shura, right, or whatever you want to call it? Al Qaeda Central, Al Qaeda General Command. But then they go on to mention that there's 8,000 to 10,000 foreign fighters that are fighting alongside the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they says mainly comprised of individuals, I'm quoting from this, Central Asia, North Caucasus region of the Russian Republic, Russian Federation, Pakistan, and Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in China, among others. Well, we know that Al Qaeda helps bring these individuals from and it also goes on to say that most of them are affiliated with the Taliban. Many also support Al Qaeda. I think it's more than this is sort of one little critique I have of this report. Al Qaeda brings them in, helps them get organized, helps them get into the groups. And then what they do, and this report talks about this too, is the Taliban wants these people fighting under the Taliban banner. They don't want them to identify as Al Qaeda or the Turkestan Islamic Party, which we know is basically an Al Qaeda branch. Abdullah Haq al-Turkestani is the head of the Turkestan Islamic Party, is also an Al Qaeda leader. So what does that make his followers? Again, it goes on and on here, but, we're talking, a potential 10, it could be 10,000 foreign fighters, mostly, mostly affiliated with Al Qaeda. What does this, how does that mean that Al Qaeda is going to return to Afghanistan? And do we really think that over the horizon strikes, where are they going to be based? Pakistan isn't going to do it. They said no. Obviously, Iran's out. Given U.S.-Russian relations, I don't think any of the stands are going to agree to base U.S. forces. So you're left with the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia, or aircraft carriers, or strikes from, perhaps from the Gulf or whatnot. And you're going to go after 8,000 to 10,000 foreign terrorist fighters. And again, and by the way, if some of them are affiliated with the Islamic State as well, how are we going to do this? We couldn't do this with U.S. troops in country, with U.S. air bases. It couldn't be beaten back. You had Taliban gains despite that, which the UN also notes. Oh, I'm sorry, Tom. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. I just wanted to give one additional point on that. It's not even that they don't even pretend that they're going to go after all these foreign fighters.
No.
The over the horizon refers to, I think, two things. One, possibly providing air support to the Afghan government, in terms of battles. Maybe that's a big maybe around.
Yeah, but they mainly said counterterrorism.
But they've been providing some air cover to some of the Afghans in the months since the drawdown began. But yes, that's why I'm saying it's a maybe, because I don't know that they're going to continue to do that at all. Maybe not at all. But the other thing is the counterterrorism point. So the counterterrorism point is that for over the horizon means they think that the implicit argument is that they can distinguish between this vast pool of foreign jihadis and those that are actually just a threat to the U.S. or the West, right? Yeah, good luck with that, right? Good luck figuring out from this pool, who in there is somebody that you need to launch a drone strike from afar or whatever, or, a cruise missile strike or air strike, however you're going to try and carry it out. Good luck trying to figure that out. You're gonna have very limited capacity in that regard. And the epistemological problems for understanding Al Qaeda in Afghanistan existed throughout the last 20 years. I don't think they're going to get better upon retreating, right? I don't think these issues are all going to suddenly clear up now that the U.S. is out of country. But here's one other point about the defining Al Qaeda and the numbers, right, Bill? See, and this is why the numbers game doesn't make any sense. Well, we just talked about Siraj Haqqani being, according to the same report, a member of the wider Al Qaeda leadership. A couple additional facts. We know from other reporting from the Treasury Department and the UN that the Haqqanis have talked about building a new joint army with Al Qaeda. We know that the Qanis are already overlapping with Al Qaeda, not just in Surajuddin, but all sorts of other figures in the Qanis are overlapping with Al Qaeda currently. And we know that Qanis have thousands of fighters under the command in Afghanistan, under the Taliban's banner. And we know that the Qanis have been deeply in bed with Al Qaeda since basically the beginning, and that oftentimes you can't even distinguish between the two, right? How do we know how much of the Qani network is really just part of Al Qaeda? I mean, at what point do you become? Is it Al Qaeda linked, or just a misdefinition on our part in terms of understanding this stuff, right?
And it's not just Suraj Haqqani. I mean, what about Mullah
brothers
Zakir and outside, I'm talking outside the Haqqanis. Yeah, how many of these Taliban leaders have support in Helmand? I mean, that's not the Haqqanis. Yet Asim Umar and Zawahiri's courier are killed in Helmand. Yet another senior Al Qaeda leader killed in Nimruz. These are areas that are not traditional Haqqani network. So we're talking, there's tens of thousands of Haqqani fighters without a doubt. We're talking. What point are we debating? What is Al Qaeda? What is the Taliban? How are we able to even draw lines between the two at this point?
Well, and the other thing about the report is it accurately says that the Qanis are basically the most effective combat fighting force for the Taliban. Well, if the Qanis are deeply in bed with Al Qaeda to the extent where you can't even distinguish between the two in a lot of cases, who's the most effective combat fighting force for the Taliban in 2021? Right. I'll leave it there, I think, for listeners to understand that, in my view of all this is that basically the emperor is nude, that these epistemological problems mean that the U.S. has, even after all these years and hundreds of billions of dollars, did not build an effective understanding of this stuff, or robust understanding of stuff. I think there are pockets of understanding of it inside the U.S. government, but there's a lot of work yet to be done, even as the U.S. tries to bring its involvement in these wars to a close.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I mean, I think it's appropriate that we end this on one of many questions, and we keep looking for clarity on this, and unfortunately keeps getting more cloudy and more cloudy. Perhaps we'll get some more information on the Hatim Shore. Perhaps we'll get more understanding of the Haqqani, Taliban, Al Qaeda nexus. I think you and I actually have a pretty good understanding of that. But we're craving this information to be put out by the U.S. government, by the United Nations, which again does an excellent job with this report. But the problem here in the United States is there is no interest in fighting these wars anymore. So it really takes away the desire to explain this. But I know you and I hope and pray that this doesn't come back to bite us.
Well, even when there wasn't interest in fighting these wars, the U.S. didn't get it right. So, right. So there you go. Well, this has been episode 50 of Generation Jihad. It's as chipper and as upbeat as usual. Again, if you're looking for some happy talk, don't come here, folks. But thank you for listening to episode 50 of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts, and we will see you again soon.